China has one of the weirdest tax laws that will make you think twice about moving there. In today's video, we will be discussing China's major tax problems. China has a major tax problem. The country's financial system is at the forefront of development and provides tremendous opportunities, but China's customs regime is a time bomb that will eventually explode under the weight of its own contradictions. China's economy is much larger than that of any other country, so they need to spend more on government activities. This requires a lot of money, and China doesn't have that. The U.S. is China's closest peer when it comes to size, and they have federal tax revenues of around $250 billion a year. This video is about taxes. It's instead more worthwhile to look at the systemic problems with China's economy rather than considering its recent economic growth. In order to become fully sustainable in the long term, China will need a new system that is not so dependent on debt. Before we start today's video, make sure to like and subscribe so we can continue to push out new content every day. But before we deep dive into this topic, let's take a look at some specific issues. Why can't China raise more taxes from its economy? Will the lack of tax revenue impact China's growth? Once we have done all of this, we can put China on the Economics Explained national leaderboard. China has three problems with tax collection. The majority of people aren't paying taxes in the first place, those that are doing their best to avoid them, and the country's complicated tax structure doesn't help. China operates with a central authority, but there is no single man or institution that can oversee 1.4 billion people in one of the biggest countries in the world. Each province has their own way of assigning authority to regions and cities, so there's no clean answer here. All these different local authorities are responsible for certain government functions and do a good job at them as well. As you can imagine, some tasks are too small or regionally specific to be controlled by the national organizations above them. This is why the People's Party Congress is governing. So they consult the provincial government body that will likely delegate it to a city council. And this is not unusual. It's basically the same system that I imagine your own governments use to do their work. Outside of the US and Canada, local governments primarily get their funding from two sources: property taxes and funds sent over from a higher level of government. The government gives money to the states, who then give it to their local governments. They can also have other sources of revenue like fines for speeding tickets and business taxes. But those are pretty much irrelevant next to these two. China's local governments make most of their money by taxing businesses and selling off 20 to 70-year leases on their landholdings in China. No private company has that kind of staying power. This game of chicken and egg does two things. It creates a glut of infrastructure in China. Ghost cities and railways that carry no passengers are not uncommon sights. The second thing is that it stresses the energy grid and leads to major power outages. We just did a video about this. The second thing it does is require a lot of upfront investment by these provincial governments. The problem is that these governments are not allowed to issue bonds, and they don't start making land revenues until they sell off their land holding. Government agencies are looking for innovative financing solutions to provide for the necessary services people need. Local governments want to make sure these resources are being used wisely, so they set up private companies with an ownership structure where they physically own some of the assets that is providing a service. This can be cash shares, state enterprises, or land rights. A so-called private company could then go to the bank, use all of these assets as collateral, and obtain a loan. Government ownership of infrastructure is made possible through bank loans. With all this money being circulated, banks can bundle these up and sell them to investment firms. In 2019, government bonds were worth 39% of the worldwide financing market. 60% of the remaining territory was once mainly made up of real estate bonds sold by the development companies in order to fund the construction on leased land. This trend, however, changed when these large companies were denied access to overseas investors. This local government financing platform, there are safeguards in regards to debts not being repaid. A majority of China's investors do not believe the government would ever default on their debts due to these protections. This is also beneficial for the government because it means their liabilities, i.e. national debt, are being taken care of by people in the private sector. Stats like GDP and debt-to-GDP ratios can be misleading sometimes since they only track government debts rather than all debts, including those from the private sector. Local governments are facing the problem of how they can raise funds, but some of them can go bankrupt because of this and might not have support from up above. So far, this whole system has been fine because the real estate market has constantly depreciated in value, which means that reckless borrowing practices can be made up for with money from renting out land. But this trend is beginning to change, and I'm not sure it's going to work anymore. Firstly, China might still be practicing strict lockdowns to prevent COVID from further spreading. The government has a zero-tolerance policy that means entire cities like Shanghai will go into lockdown if any cases are detected. Employees are now banned from leaving their homes outside of taking care of basic needs. All this is having a detrimental effect on businesses like supermarkets, who are already struggling in the country because of declining sales. Locals rely heavily on things like business taxes for revenue, so this drop in activity has had a huge impact for various state authorities. Chinese people have lost faith in the industry, but the chance of this happening to you is, likely, low. Fewer people are buying houses, which means less effort is put into building them. This in turn means that fewer projects will bring in the revenue and upkeep required by local governments. And banks are no longer interested in accepting land as collateral for those local bonds. The greater the problem becomes. The Chinese government is responsible for issuing tax returns to the people in order to make up for the detriment caused by their home lockdowns. They are also pushing for more infrastructure projects to offset the possible economic costs of these citywide closures. When a company is financially stable, it often has the ability to take on debt. This means that more money is coming in and less going out. However, when the financial gaps are large and there is not enough cash injected into the business, it needs investments by external sources like banks or investors. Meanwhile, highly speculative investments like real estate can be deemed to have no risk. This is an even bigger market than the entire GDP of China. And this doesn't even take into account the other problem with how the Chinese government handles land leases, which come to an end after 2270 years. And some of those less than 1-year leases have now expired. It's going to be difficult for the government to decide what to do with the land they own with those shorter leases. The government has traditionally agreed to give back the land if it wasn't being used for anything, but people are unhappy about this because they will have nowhere else to live and the land constitutes their biggest investment. It's a widespread belief in China that land leases will never be taken back off people.